Well, Mississippi State isn't outspending the SEC, but is the NIL gap really as bad as you think?
You are Locked On Mississippi State, your daily podcast on the Mississippi State Bulldogs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Locked On Mississippi State podcast. I'm your host, Jaron Spor. Today's episode is brought to you by Kalshi. For a limited time, download the Kalshi app and use code LOCKEDON to get $10 when you trade $10. We've got a full show for you today because today we're talking about one of the biggest conversations in college football right now, money. Specifically, how much Mississippi State is actually spending on its football roster. A new CBS report places Mississippi State in a certain tier for its 2026 roster. It's obviously not as high as some of the other big ones as like Texas, LSU, stuff like that. But here's where things get really interesting. Mississippi State isn't sitting in some completely different financial universe from the rest of the SEC. In fact, every SEC program is reportedly above $20 million. And I'll tell you who else Mississippi State is grouped up with. And today, we're going to ask three questions. First, where does Mississippi State's reported spending actually tell us about the state of the program? What does it tell us? Second, is 25 to 26 million enough to compete in the SEC? Or does State need to push north of 30 million? And third, what does this mean for the future of Mississippi State football? Because there's a huge difference between saying Mississippi State doesn't spend enough and saying Mississippi State doesn't spend $40 million. Those are not the same thing. But let's get into it right now. So let's start with the headline. Mississippi State is reportedly spending between $20 million and $29 million on its 2026 football roster. So CBS Sports, what they did is they talked to 50 industry sources. They could be GMs of teams, SEC teams. It could be agents. It could be, whatever, 50 of them. They came up with a bracket for each different conference. So it was spending over 40 million, over 30 million, over 20 million, and then below 20 million. The SEC was the only conference to not have anyone below 20 million. Okay. So Mississippi State fell in that over 20 million, but below the 30 million. Now I know what some people are going to hear when they say that, when they see that. They're going to hear, well, that's not enough. And that's fair. If you're comparing Mississippi State to the team spending 40 million plus, but that's not really the story. The story is that Mississippi State is operating in the same broad spending tier as several other SEC programs. The reported 20 to 29 million tier includes Arkansas, Kentucky, Mississippi State, obviously, Missouri, South Carolina, and Vanderbilt. And importantly, the reporting indicates there isn't an SEC team below 20 million, like I mentioned. So those are all at the bottom tier of the SEC. But if you look at all the other Power 4 conferences, which they do in the report, there's a lot of teams below the 20 million. Mississippi State's not that. So that's significant because for years, one of the narratives surrounding Mississippi State has been State just can't compete because it doesn't have the NIL resources. Well, maybe that's too simplistic because Mississippi State isn't operating at $10 million. They're not sitting at $15 million. While everyone else is at $30 million, they're reportedly somewhere in the $20 million. That means the program has made a significant investment in football. And that's important because roster construction is becoming increasingly expensive. This isn't 2021 anymore. This isn't even 2024 anymore. Think back to that. Ohio State wins the national championship in 2024, and the feeling was they were the first $20 million roster. Well, now that's a low end for the SEC right now. You aren't building an SEC roster with a handful of NIL deals and some transfer additions. The entire roster has to be managed. Retention matters. Transfers matter, high school recruiting matters, and keeping your best players from leaving matters. But here's where this thing gets really interesting because $25 million might actually be enough to compete. So one SEC general manager gave CBS Sports a fascinating perspective. The quote was essentially this: 25 to 26 million is the prerequisite to be competitive. But he also added that realistically, you probably need to be north of 30 million to win it. Well, that's a really important distinction because there are three different conversations happening here. Can you compete? Can you win? Can you consistently compete for championships? Those aren't necessarily the same thing. So if Mississippi State is sitting around 25 million, they may put the Bulldogs in position, that might actually put them in position to build a competitive roster. But if you're trying to compete with the very top of the SEC, you're going to need more, a lot more. But this is where I think Mississippi State fans should look at this report differently. Instead of, we're never going to have enough NIL, the conversation should be, how do we move from the 20s into the 30s? And I'm saying that in terms of, and everyone else stays right here. Because obviously if teams move up to the 50s, then yeah, you need to go up to the 40s really. But that's much a more realistic problem to have. Because now you're talking about closing a gap. You're not trying to create an entire infrastructure from scratch. You're trying to improve it. And there's another reason this number matters. Because Mississippi State doesn't have to outspend everybody. This is where I want to push back on the idea that Mississippi State needs to spend $40 million to have a good football team. No, you just need to spend efficiently. If you're Mississippi State, you aren't going to beat the biggest programs in the country dollar for dollar. So what do you have to do? You have to identify where your money matters most. Quarterback, offensive line, pass rush, secondary, retention. Those are areas where you can potentially make enormous differences with the right investments. And then you have to develop. That's the part people sometimes forget. Money can buy talent. It can't automatically create a team. You still need coaching, development, culture, scheme, player evaluation, continuity. That's where Jeff Lebby and his staff have to prove themselves. But think about the teams I listed them with. Yeah, Arkansas, Kentucky aren't very good. They're on that list as well. Vanderbilt just had a 10-win season last year. South Carolina a couple years ago in 2024, they went 9-4, and they were one of the hottest teams in college football at the end of the season. They have a star quarterback. They have a star 5-star pass rusher. They've signed some star 5-star guys. They have some, I believe, committed right now even. So they're deciding where to use their money, and yet they're still in the same tier as Mississippi State. Now, they weren't very good last year, and so I know the comments of me will say, well, they weren't good last year, but they've had good years. That's the point. Vanderbilt went 10-2 during the regular season last year, 10-3 overall, and they're not spinning elite. South Carolina went 9-4, again, 9-3 in the regular season, one of the hottest teams at the end, one of the first teams left out. That was in 2024. They're in this tier as well. Like, these teams have proven you can win at this level. The SEC general manager proved you can win at this level. Now, can you consistently be competitive? No. Can you compete for the national, compete for your SEC title and the national? Probably not. But you can at least be competitive enough where you get a 8, 9, 10-win season and then see what happens after that. But I want to hear from you guys at home. Do you think Mississippi State's NIL spending is actually a bigger problem than people make it out to be? Because I hear all the time about they're broke. And if you go look at all these conferences and how much money they're spending on the roster, there's several teams way below Mississippi State. Several. One of the most shocking, and they weren't below Mississippi State, they're at the same level, was Florida State. Florida State was in that range. And that was kind of surprising given, the history of that program. But, all right, real quick, coming up, where does Mississippi State actually sit compared to the rest of the SEC? And why being in the 20 to 29 million tier isn't necessarily a bad thing. Well, there are more live events than ever we're seeing right now. Games, concerts, comedy shows, festivals. The hard part usually isn't deciding what you want to attend. It's actually getting the tickets. Between long wait times, confusing checkout processes, and surprise fees, buying tickets can sometimes feel harder than it should. That's where so many fans, that's why they're turning to Gametime. The app is built to make buying tickets simple with upfront pricing, seat views before you buy, and exclusive savings opportunities that help you get to the events you want without the usual hassle. There's two things that I hate about buying tickets online. And that is, one, you find a ticket and you're like, man, it's only $70. And then you get all the way to checkout. Next thing you know, it's $140. I hate that. The other thing I hate is you're kind of guessing, especially if you're at an arena that you've never been to, you're kind of guessing where you're going to sit. Well, Gametime fixes both of those issues. You know how much you're going to pay when you pick your ticket. You don't have to wait till checkout to figure that out. And then they have the seat view that lets you see where you're going to sit and what kind of view you're going to have. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets to every type of event with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Well, thanks for making Locked On Mississippi State your first listen every single day, part of Locked On Podcast Network. Now the #1 sports podcast network. All right, so let's put this into perspective, because when you hear 20 to 29 million, it's easy to think that's the bottom. But that's not really what this data says. Mississippi State is grouped with Arkansas, Kentucky, Missouri, South Carolina, and Vanderbilt. That's 6 SEC programs in the same general spending range. And that's actually one of the most fascinating parts of this report. And I forgot to mention, by the way, I mentioned the 10-win season for Vanderbilt. I mentioned the 9-win season for South Carolina. Missouri had back-to-back. I don't remember if it went double-digit both years. I think it was 11-2 and then 10-3 seasons. Missouri. So that's another example. But the SEC is the only power conference where every team reportedly clears $20 million in roster spending. So think about that. The floor is incredibly high. That's part of what makes this conference so difficult. Even programs that aren't considered traditional national powers are investing significant resources into football. And that means Mississippi State isn't competing against a few elite programs. It's competing against an entire league that is spending aggressively. Now, this isn't an argument that Mississippi State is suddenly financially equal to Georgia or Texas or LSU or whatever. It's not. The upper end of the sport is operating at a different level. CBS Sports reporting shows just how expensive the top rosters have become, with some programs pushing into the $40 million plus range. There were 7 total that they listed. I believe in the SEC it was LSU, Texas, Texas A&M. Then you had Miami in the ACC. Then you had Oregon and Ohio State in the Big Ten. And then you had Notre Dame. But there is absolutely a financial gap. But here's the important part. Mississippi State doesn't need to close the entire gap overnight. If State can move from the lower end of the 20s toward, or even if they're in the middle range of the 20s, because it doesn't give you exact where they're at, but you can move that towards 30 million, that's meaningful. And if you're wondering whether that extra money actually matters, look where it can be spent. Because this is the conversation I want Mississippi State fans having. If the Bulldogs find another 5 million, where does it go? I don't think you just spread it around. I think you target it. Obviously, quarterback. If Kamario Taylor becomes the quarterback everybody expects him to become, you have to retain him. And it might take that. Offensive line. We spent the entire offseason talking about this position. If you develop a really good offensive lineman, keep him. Don't let him walk. Defensive line. This has been a major weakness for Mississippi State as well. If you find difference makers, pay to retain them. And then there's the most important part, recruiting. Because the best long-term NIL strategy isn't just buying transfers. It's building a roster where you recruit high school players, develop them, and then retain them. Mississippi State cannot build this roster entirely through the transfer portal. It's expensive, it's volatile, and you're constantly replacing people. The better model is to recruit, develop, retain, then supplement through the portal. That's sustainable. And that's where Jeff Lebby and Zach Selman have to show that they're building something. But here's the positive takeaway. Mississippi State is already reportedly operating in the same broad financial tier as several SEC programs. So this isn't we have no money. It's we need to maximize what we're doing with the money we have and eventually increase the investment. That's a very different conversation. So the question for you would be, would you rather see Mississippi State spend $30 million plus on the roster or stay around $25 million but dramatically improve how that money is allocated? That's the question. Are you happy with how they're allocating it? Because I truly think I would assume Kamario is getting pretty big dollars. Like, I would assume, I know he hasn't started but a couple games, but he's the highest rated recruit in the history of the program. His evaluation on the On3 is $1.5 million. Again, that's just an evaluation. But I'm assuming he's getting quite a bit of money. So they're doing great there. We just have to see what they do with the rest of the roster. Because quarterback, I feel like they've made the investment. You could argue that at wide receiver, they've made the investment. But I don't feel like they've made necessarily the investment on the offensive line. I think even at running back, they made the investment because I think Fluff is probably not cheap. And then you got Isaac Smith on defense. Kelly Jones probably wasn't cheap to keep. But I think about the best NFL teams, or really NFL teams in general. You have to have a quarterback, you have to protect the quarterback, and you have to get after the quarterback. That's what they prioritize. That's what Mississippi State should prioritize in that order. Obviously, if you have a big-time corner like Kelly Jones, you don't say, well, we got to prioritize this. We might have to let you walk. No, that's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying, like, Kamario, you have to have a quarterback. Kamario, you got it. Now you got to protect the quarterback. I don't know if the investment's been there on the offensive line like it should be. Then they got to get after the quarterback. I don't know if the investment on the defensive line has been where it should be. Those are the three big things. Then after that, you look at some skill positions like wide receiver, running back. You look at safety, corners, the secondary as a whole, linebackers, and you kind of go on the list after that. But I feel like they've done really good on the first. They haven't really done a great job on the other two that have always been the priority of the NFL. And I think if they kind of just adopted that NFL model, actually, I saw an interview the other day, and it was with Todd McShay. And he was actually being asked about, I can't remember what team he was getting asked about, but he said if teams want to, he said really teams are already doing it, but if you're not doing it and you want to know, okay, how do we build this staff to, maximize what we're doing? And he actually made fun of North Carolina because remember they said when Michael Lombardi and Bill Belichick got this job, they're the 33rd NFL team. That's how they were going to operate like. And he was making fun of them because they haven't operated like that at all. He said, really, the 33rd NFL team is what Oklahoma's doing. So they hired a general manager, which was Jim Nagy, who had a long time experience in the NFL as a scout, was then the director of the Senior Bowl. He then hired a ton of scouts around him on his staff. And so because of that, they handle all of that. Now, obviously, a coach comes in and gives the evaluation and says, hey, no, I like this guy, and can we do that? Like, yeah, they still have a little bit of a say, but they go do all that groundwork for him. And he was even saying that throughout the year, their scouts are scouting players who they think might be in the portal. So when they do enter the portal, they're not behind having to play catch up. They're ready to go. That's what teams have to do. And I think Mississippi State, they're making their way to that direction. But this is just such a new era for everyone that you have to kind of figure things out as you go. And, okay, this might work here, but it might not work over here. Okay, well, let's try this and that. Like, I think, they hired Marshall Levinson, which I brought up as a recruiting coordinator. Thought that was a great, which I don't think recruiting coordinator was actually his official title, but I thought that was a great hire for them. I mentioned that there. I think he's actually the assistant director of player personnel. Yeah, he is. I thought that was a great hire, and you just get more guys like that to kind of help with that. Again, hire your general manager, your scouting department, do all that. And then I think Mississippi State, you're probably in business at that point. But anyways, coming up, what does this mean for Jeff Lebby? Because eventually the money conversation turns into an expectation conversation. All right, well, support from today's show comes from Kalshi because before the season even kicks off, everyone's making predictions. Who wins the division? Who makes the playoff? Who's lifting the trophy at season's end? On Kalshi, America's #1 prediction market platform, you can trade those predictions in a live market. So again, I was looking at a future trade, and I was looking at the AFC Championship winner. So I went to the Kansas City Chiefs. Obviously, they had kind of a dynasty rolling and then really struggled last year. But what is their probability to win the AFC? Well, they are currently trading at an 11% probability, meaning a $100 trade will pay out $784.91 if they take home the title. So again, that's a team that has been there, done that. So maybe that's a safe trade for you to go in on. And, that it's not quite the highest one. The highest probability is Buffalo Bills at 16%. So maybe you can earn some extra money there. Well, on Kalshi, you're trading against peers in a live market, meaning there's no house, and as the probability changes, you can buy in and out of your position. Trade the draft pick, game, and more on Kalshi. Download the Kalshi app and use code LOCKEDON to get $10 when you trade $10. That's Kalshi, Kalshi. Trade on anything. 18 plus only. Restrictions and eligibility requirements apply. Event contract trading involves risk and may not be suitable for all investors. Kalshi products are not available in all jurisdictions. Prices, values, and available markets may differ from those mentioned. For more information, see kalshi.com/regulatory. Well, thanks for making Locked On Mississippi State your first listen every single day. Part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So let's dive into this a little more, because here's where I think this report becomes really important. Because this isn't just about NIL. It's about expectations. If Mississippi State is spending $20 to $29 million on its roster, then the question becomes, what should the results look like? That's where Jeff Lebby comes into the conversation. Because I don't want to hear anybody say and think, well, State spends $25 million, so everything's fine. No, that's not what I want you to get out of this conversation. The money has to produce something. But it does change the argument. If somebody says Mississippi State can't compete because they don't have the NIL, the data gives you a pretty good response. They're investing. Now you have to see the results. Would I like Mississippi State to eventually get above $30 million? Absolutely. I think they should. If the SEC is becoming a league where $25 to $26 million is essentially the entry point for competitiveness, Mississippi State cannot be satisfied with simply being at the bottom of that range. The goal should be to move up. But you also can't pretend that going from $25 million to $35 million automatically produces 8 or 9 wins. It doesn't. You still have to coach. Like Florida, for example, was one in the $30 million. Well, they're not having a ton of success, right? We've talked about them. But this is where the NIL conversation meets the Jeff Lebby conversation. Because Jeff Lebby is entering year 3. The roster is better. The staff is better. The investment is significant. Kamario Taylor has generated national buzz. Zach Arnett is back running the defense. The offensive line has been rebuilt. There's more talent. There's more depth. So now, go win. That's the next step. Because Mississippi State doesn't need to become Georgia overnight, but it does need to show tangible progress. And if it does, the NIL investment, they start to look even smarter. Because now you're creating momentum. More wins, better recruiting, better retention, more investment, better players, more wins. Again, more wins. That's the cycle Mississippi State wants. This report should actually challenge the way we talk about Mississippi State football. Because stop making the conversation, can State afford to compete? Start making it, how efficiently can State compete? Because those are two different questions. Mississippi State may never be the biggest spender in the SEC, and that's okay. The Bulldogs can still win games. They can still recruit. They can still develop players. They can still build a roster. But the margin for error is smaller. And that's where coaching matters. So here's my takeaway from CBS Sports' report. Mississippi State's NIL situation isn't perfect. It needs to improve. I'd like to see the Bulldogs move beyond the 20 to 29 million tier eventually. But this idea that Mississippi State is completely incapable of competing financially, the numbers don't support that. They're investing. They're in the SEC's financial conversation. And according to one SEC GM, being around 25 to 26 million can put you in position to compete. The next question is whether Mississippi State can turn that investment into wins. Because that's ultimately what this is about. Not the number, not the headline, the results. So one final time, I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think Mississippi State is spending enough to compete in the SEC right now, or does the program need to get above 30 million? And by compete, I just mean not compete for the SEC title. I'm just saying compete to get to 7, 8, 9 wins, because I truly think they are. I do. All right, so now on video, we're going to send you to the first ever 24/7 YouTube channel on college sports, and on audio, check out Locked On College Football with Spencer McLaughlin for your second listen. For Locked On Mississippi State, I'm Jaron, and until next time, Hail State.